Reviewing the scientific literature to answer your questions about gender diversity, this is Classroom Psychology. And now here's your host, Dr. Cora Sargent. Hello everybody and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host Cora. Thank you so very much for joining me. It's so good to see you. Hey, get on in here. Let's talk about gender diversity. And my goodness, this week, more than any week, we need to talk about gender diversity because the CAS review was released in the UK, the review of gender identity development services, kind of how we work with transgender and gender diverse and questioning children and young people in the UK. And the review was about as pessimistic as I had imagined it would be. There were some really beautiful elements of this review. I really appreciate certain things in it, like Hilary Cass saying young people just want to be heard and believed. I think that's a wonderful thing to say in the report, and I think it's a really good, for a moment, let's just kind of luxuriate in that moment, right? Young people, and if only the report was making that sole statement, young people just want to be heard and believed, because for sure they do. But the review goes on to do a bunch of stuff, and the big findings of the review are essentially that, hormone blockers and gender affirming hormones are not well evidenced. Like the long-term studies aren't there. The psychological outcomes don't seem to be obvious in the reviewed literature. And they consider that social transition might be problematic in some way. They review a bunch of literature. They don't have a systematic review on this, but they review a bunch of literature, including Zucker's studies. We've talked about this in the past. And their conclusion on social transition that it might be problematic for young people, rather than an opportunity for young people to find themselves and to thrive, is interesting, given that we've done an episode on social transition before. And my understanding of the literature, it's a bit more positive than their review. Also, gender affirming hormones they considered needed to be restricted, that we should only prescribe them in exceptional circumstances below the age of 18. And goodness. And then they considered that the children and young people services needed to be up to the age of 25, which is no bad thing, like 0 to 25. These broad holistic services that are being recommended by the CAS review, I think, are a wonderful thing. But there's also, a recommendation 24 in the review is that they bring forward the service specifications for new adult services. The new service specifications, which basically say they only look after people over the age of 25, which would mean that in lieu of having any young people services in existence, like in the UK right now, we don't have any, right? Because they closed the gender identity development service in London and they haven't yet opened these new clinics. So there is no service for young people right now. And in lieu of those being created, they're supposed to be created next year. The request, I think, is to bring forward the recommendation to only give adult services to people over 25. So that is terrifying because there are young people right now waiting for adult services, either who have aged out of young person services before they could get an appointment, which is often the case, given that, waiting times are 2 to 4 years or something right now. And there are young people, aged 18 to 25 waiting for their first appointment at the Gender Identity Development Service, the Gender Identity Clinics, the adult services, and unable potentially to get one if the service specifications change. So, it's all in the air and it's all very scary. But at the heart of the CAS review, there are two big systematic reviews. There are actually 6 big systematic reviews, but there are 2 that are really kind of important to this. One is on the effect of puberty blockers, and one is on the effect of gender affirmative hormones for, children and young people. Now, we're going to talk about those in detail, particularly when it comes to the psychological outcomes, because there's a decision that the reviewers made, which I think has some quite far-reaching implications, and it'd be worth us having a look at. But Today, much like we do every time we come together, we take a confident statement from a politician or public figure or, a book author or podcast host, maybe. In this case, though, one of the highest politicians in the land, the current Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, because she made a statement, of course, on the Cass review. There is a content warning here for my gender diverse kith and kin. I know that you're feeling this right now. I'm feeling it too. That's how I know. I am somebody who has been through transition. I'm not waiting for gender identity services now. I'm still engaged in transition for sure. But I got to tell you, I was rattled by what happened this week. It really shook me. I'm an anxious person anyway. I do get anxious. That's what I do. I do love anxiety so much that it's my bedfellow. But so I'm not surprised in a sense that I felt anxious this week. But I got to tell you, it was real hard this week. Not only from the actual Cass review itself, which I got to say often is quite optimistic in a lot of ways, right? Like, they have these ideas for holistic services that really look after children, young people in all kinds of different ways, and that include support for transition where needed. So I think, that's a good thing. But the conservative outcomes, the call for only, hormone treatment for over 18s, to restrict the use of puberty blockers outside of research, to potentially restrict adult care to over 25s, and to bring that forward, and then to see the public callings, to see J.K. Rowling's comments on Twitter, which were just like something akin to a victory dance that felt very unpleasant to watch, and to see, the countless speakers online and on social media, and even in like traditional media, like people talking in very hard tones about our community, and how we're some kind of ideology that is influencing people, or that we're somehow like just our very existence could be harmful to children, young people, just by us being ourselves in the world. And that's hard to listen to. It's hard to hear. So no, my friends, my siblings out there, you are family to me, and I care about you a great deal. And please look after yourself this week. And when we listen to Victoria Atkins' statement, because it is pretty difficult to hear. So here is, as we always do, their current Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins.
With your permission, I would like to make a statement on the Cass review of gender identity services for children and young people. And may I say how pleased I am to be joined by parents of children who have been affected by some of the issues raised in this review, and I hope all of us will bear the sensitivities of this debate in mind as we discuss it this afternoon. This review strikes hard and strikes sure at an area of public policy where fashionable cultural values have overtaken evidence, safety, and biological reality. This must now stop.
Thanks to Victoria Atkins for such an interesting question, posed as they often are in the form of confident declaration. I think she might have moved a little bit beyond the Cass review there, talking about how this ideology has overtaken biological reality. None of that in the Cass review, thankfully. But hey, it's not super surprising that the government of today uses this as an opportunity to marginalize us further. And honestly, I gotta say that the whole experience here is pretty galling, not least because the thrust of the Cass review is that there isn't enough research in this field, right? There's not enough high quality research in particular. And in the sort of systematic reviews, like Taylor and colleagues' systematic reviews from this year, which was one of the ones which fueled the Cass review and into gender affirming hormones, they make the conclusion, there's not enough high quality research in this field. as though that's the fault of trans people, right? As though that's our fault. Because the reason, of course, there's not enough high quality research in this field, I think trans people would agree that we need more high quality research in this field. We'd love it. The reason that we haven't been able to get it is because nobody's investing in this field, right? Nobody is investing in the services, much less in research. And so the people who are trying to do the research that, are engaged in the research in this field, they're not super well-funded multi-lab clinics getting government grants on, research around transgender healthcare. They're just groups of researchers with a vested interest desperately trying to make it work. Like, it's not some massive group of, it's not as if we've got like these big organizations in the UK with super huge amounts of public funding to conduct big multi-lab trials, of working in gender diversity. There's none of that. Government hasn't announced millions of pounds investment in the last 10 years in research for transgender healthcare. So the reason why there's no friggin' high quality studies, marginalization, folks, marginalization. The trans community know it well. For goodness sake, I still take estrogen. Of course I do. I'll be taking it for the rest of my life, hopefully, if I can keep getting it prescribed. But as I open my pack of Pro-Gynova and take out the leaflet, it still says the risks and concerns, the cautions for postmenopausal women. Because although I've been taking it for 10 years, although people have been transitioning for 80 years, the government still hasn't invested any money in actually working out what drugs are right for us. In drug development for the trans community, we still use off-label medications designed for other people because marginalization, right? So for the central government to use this review and as an argument to marginalize us further without appreciating that it's their marginalization that led to this problem, I find that galling, darling. I find it galling, darling. I don't know what that was, forgive me. But listen, we'll take it. For the question that we know is intended to be, and we will take a look at the literature to see if we can't find an answer. In particular, we are going to look at gender-affirming hormones. The reason is because let's pass some comment generally at the systematic reviewing of the CAS review. There's like 6 systematic reviews underneath it. Two ones that I really want to focus on generally, but one we'll focus on today. The 2 are one on puberty blockers and one on gender-affirming hormones. Now, puberty blockers are a little bit more complicated when it comes to psychological outcomes. We're not going to comment on the medicine, of course. I'm not that kind of doctor. But we will comment on the psychology. The question of puberty blockers is really tricky because the review kind of says, look, we don't think that people's gender dysphoria is alleviated by puberty blockers, right? The problem for me is that philosophically, I don't know that's what puberty blockers are designed to do. I want you to imagine that you are a trans guy, right? And that you are watching that terrible vigil in the mirror as you watch, you get the first spotting, the first breast bud development. You start to, like, your waistline starts to rise, up to near your belly button. Your body starts to feminize against your will, right? And those changes are distressing. If you take puberty blockers, right, it will stop puberty, but it won't undo those changes. It's not going to turn back the clock. It's not going to make things different. It's just going to prevent things from being any more different. So to my mind, are puberty blockers designed to reduce distress, or are they designed to prevent changes that would otherwise cause further distress? Are they designed to prevent worsening distress? I don't know. I think maybe the latter more than the former, but again, this isn't really my field. Talking about puberty blockers and the effects. Honestly, I don't know, but I do question whether or not that's a legitimate kind of aim for the systematic review. If there's no alleviation of distress, does it work? I don't know if it's if not worsening distress, if they're pausing a puberty that would otherwise worsen distress, if that's not the aim, if the aim of puberty blockers isn't stability. rather than improvement in psychological functioning, right? Now, when it comes to gender-affirming hormones, Taylor's review is really interesting. The reason we want to focus here is because the outcome of gender-affirming hormones is a bit more clear, right? That's designed to have a positive impact on people's lives. That is designed to reduce gender dysphoria, right? Increase gender euphoria and increase psychological functioning. That's fundamentally the point of gender-affirming hormones, right? I go through feminizing hormones, and the aim is to alleviate my distress. It's also to, help me to feel like a complete whole person in the world, because, I feel like I am a girl on the inside, and feeling like a girl on the outside helps me to feel like a complete person, right? So good. Psychological functioning should be the aim here. Now, Taylor's review, things get really interesting when we take a look at the psychological outcomes. There are a couple of conclusions that Taylor's review draws that are really interesting. The first is that they are looking for long-term follow-up, and they can't find enough long-term follow-up in the literature, right? There's not enough long-term follow-up. That's a reasonable critique. They say there's not enough high-quality research generally that has blinding, for example, or that has multi-lab trials. So, with more than one lab involved. So there's less risk for bias, and where they have larger scale studies and with longer term follow-up, and that have kind of blinding incorporated. So they are looking at a bunch of different features of high quality research and finding that there's not a lot of it in this field, right? And so their conclusion fundamentally is, while there are positive outcomes, it seems, in the short term from gender-affirming hormones, it's not absolutely clear that those consist into the long term, because there's not enough long-term studies, and the absence of high-quality studies in the field gives us a lot of caution when interpreting them. And that ends up with a very kind of conservative set of conclusions, right? But there's a couple of problems here. The biggest is that while they are focused on high and medium quality studies, it's not unusual for high stakes systematic reviews to exclude studies that are of low quality. Here, they are applying a standard to the literature that I think is very difficult for this field to meet, right? For example, when we talk about studies being considered higher quality if they have multi-lab, right? If they have multi-lab involvement, if there are multiple different research groups from different places conducting the research in different locations. Now, the problem, of course, with that is that in the UK, in England, for example, there's only one place that you can get gender-affirming hormones typically, and that was the Gender Identity Development Service in London, right? In lots of European countries, there's just the one place you can get these hormones from. So it's pretty unlikely, and I think it's pretty unreasonable to ask for multi-lab studies because there's only one site. So they say, there's a problem with studies that have single site recruitment, right? That recruit from a single site. But how do you recruit from multiple sites when there's only one site that's prescribing hormones? How in the world do you have multi-site recruitment if there's only one site prescribing? That seems to me to be a bit of a mistake. I don't know how you would ever do that. The second is, of course, blinding. There's a lot of focus on blinding, that these studies aren't double blind. They're not sort of randomized controlled trials. But of course, there's a bit of a problem with running randomized controlled trials in this field generally, because you can't really use placebo. I suppose you could use waitlist controls. That's not unreasonable, but you couldn't inject randomization into that without kind of messing with the waiting list, right? So there are some challenges there, but blinding in this field is almost impossible. I don't know how you blind participants to the treatment they're on, because all they need to do is look down, right, to know. So how in the world would you ever blind people to the treatment they're on? Let's say that we did a randomized controlled trial. Let's say that we go super high quality randomized controlled trial. We give people either hormones or placebo, and we watch to see the effects. There's no way that we or they are not going to know which they're on, because their body is either going to masculinize or feminize or not as a consequence, right? What do you ask them not to look down for 2 years? I don't know how you would ever do work that was blinded in this field. So I'm not sure that's particularly reasonable either. And ultimately, what they do is, of course, they do quality assurance, which we always do in systematic reviewing. We always quality assure so that we can contextualize the findings that we're talking about with deep and meaningful critique. But what they do is they only synthesize the medium and high quality studies, which is effectively excludes the low quality studies. Now, they don't describe it as excluding the low quality studies. You have to do some digging to find it. It's actually I think in this review, it's only in the abstract where they say only medium and high quality studies were synthesized, which I think is interesting. It's not super apparent that they excluded the low quality studies, but they did. And the consequences of that is that the biggest long-term, longitudinal work, the longest long-term follow-up study that they have, which is by DeVries in 2014, had a 6-year follow-up, was excluded because it's low quality. The biggest scale study, one of the biggest studies in the world, which is by Turban and colleagues in 2022, we've talked about it before, 21,598 participants in this study, they were excluded because they were too low quality in the author's mind. Even though they recruited from across all 50 states, even though they had over 20,000 participants, and I think their comparison groups were pretty robust, to my mind, they still were concerned about bias and excluded them. So here's where things get interesting. While the authors acknowledge that there isn't enough high quality research in this field, and I would actually agree with that for sure, they looked at the psychological outcomes of gender affirming hormones in adolescents, and they included only 5 studies. But because they excluded what they would describe as low quality studies, including the ones we've already discussed, they excluded 9 studies that also look at the psychological outcomes of gender affirming hormones. Now, to my mind, that's pretty telling. If you're going to run a systematic review and you have a good amount of high quality evidence, and then you have some low quality evidence, you might exclude the low quality evidence and favor the good high quality evidence that's there. But there is no high quality evidence here. There's like 1 high quality study in the whole of the systematic review. The rest were only medium quality. And so they excluded the low quality in favor of just 4 or 5 medium quality studies to look at the psychological outcomes. And to my mind, the distinction between low quality and medium quality is very arbitrary. And I gotta say that I'm not super thrilled with the number of studies and which studies they excluded, because to consider that, we can learn nothing in answer to this question from the 23,000 participants who were studied in Turban's work, to consider that we can learn nothing from the 6-year follow-up. We can learn nothing at all from the 7 other studies that were excluded. That they have nothing to say that could be relevant here is, to my mind, not wise. And I gotta say that what ends up being quite conservative, way more conservative in conclusion than most other systematic reviews in this field, including the one that was commissioned by the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, the WPATH, we find here that they're really conservative in their findings. And maybe the reason is because they couldn't allow the low quality studies to inform the review. 9 low quality studies were excluded here. So let's take a look at those 9 and find out what they said. The 5 that were included: the systematic review authors found a reduction in depression and anxiety at follow-up, although they tended not to be comparable at follow-up to adolescents not experiencing gender dysphoria or incongruence, which just kind of makes sense. Like, gender affirming hormones expose you to the violence and aggression and prejudice and discrimination we've already talked about. Minority stress theory absolutely applies here. So even if people had fully satisfying outcomes from gender affirming hormones, they'd be exposed to the sort of, the minority stress that would mean that they probably still would have some elevations in anxiety and depression. And lower treatment needs for depression and anxiety were reported after treatment in a pre-post study. They basically found that lower levels of depression in adolescents who received hormones compared to those who had wanted hormones but had not received them. they found fundamentally some very positive effects psychologically from gender affirming hormones in these 5 studies. But of course, if there's only 5 studies and none of the included studies had long-term follow-up and none of the included studies were particularly large scale, then they are going to have a lot of cautions about interpreting those 5 studies and will call for further high-quality research in this field. Again, I don't disagree with the call for high-quality research. I don't know that I agree with excluding low-quality studies. Let's take a look at those 9 low-quality, in inverted commas, studies and see what they said. We start with De Vries and colleagues. This is the nice long-term follow-up one. 2014, De Vries and colleagues, young adult psychological outcome after puberty suppression and gender reassignment, published in Pediatrics. Pretty impressive journal. Prospective cohort study with a follow-up of 6 years. They brought together 55 young adults, 22 trans women, and 33 trans men. All together from the Center of Expertise on Gender Dysphoria of the VU University Medical Center. So folks seeking gender reassignment in Amsterdam. Now, these folks, it is, there is a bit of a caveat here in that they were a part of a group of people who were engaged in, gender affirming hormones and then went on to gender reassignment surgery later. And they were invited between 2008 and 2012 to participate in the study when they were 1 year past their gender reassignment surgery. So to kind of work out, given that they might have started puberty suppression, then they went on to cross-sex hormones and they went on to gender reassignment surgery, has that improved their psychological functioning? The study designers, De Vries and colleagues, basically said that the psychological functioning of these participants seemed to improve steadily over time, resulting in rates of clinical problems that were indistinguishable from general population samples. So the percent of the participants in the clinical range for psychological functioning dropped from 30% to 7%. Their quality of life, their satisfaction with life, their subjective happiness all became similar to their peers of the same age. They say apparently the clinical protocol of a multidisciplinary team with mental health professionals, physicians, and surgeons gave these formerly gender dysphoric youth the opportunity to develop into well-functioning young adults. See, at its heart, I think the CAS review isn't off the mark in terms of wanting to provide a multidisciplinary team providing assessment and support for all different aspects of a young person's psychological functioning. But here we have an example of why that needs to include transition when it comes to transgender children and young people. Achille and colleagues in 2020, longitudinal impact of gender-affirming endocrine intervention on the mental health and well-being of transgender youths. Preliminary results from the International Journal of Pediatric Endocrinology. So Achille and colleagues brought together young people who were referred to the Pediatric Endocrine Department for Gender Dysphoria between the ages of 9 to 25 years, associated with Stony Brook University IRB for children, adolescents, and young people. So they brought together 116 participants originally, and 50 participants completed all 3 waves of data collection and started naive to endocrine therapy. So they hadn't received any hormones at the start of the intervention, right? Because they needed baseline data pre-hormone replacement therapy for these young people. So baseline data at wave 1, they measured depression and quality of life in particular, and then they were able to kind of measure them while they were on hormone therapy, gender affirming hormones, over the 3 waves of the study. And the waves were separated by, on average, 6 months. So 6 months between wave 1 and wave 2, and 6 months between wave 2 and wave 3. And the study authors found that depression scores dropped significantly for these participants between wave 1 and wave 3, with the most significant drop happening between wave 1 and wave 2. So depression was alleviated relatively quickly for this participant population when they started gender-affirming hormones. And quality of life scores increased significantly between wave 1 and 3, with the most significant increases happening between wave 2 and 3. So not in the first 6 months, but in the next 6 months, their quality of life seemed to increase once, I guess, changes had started to occur more significantly. So the authors basically say, listen, adolescence is a particularly difficult time for transgender people because they develop secondary sexual characteristics that are incongruous with their gender identity, and that is associated with depression and low quality of life and suicidal thoughts and actions, and that obviously this is a significant problem that we need to solve. And this is one of the first studies, they say, that looked at, particularly in young people in the USA, and particularly young people who've had cross-sex hormones, but that had not had any surgical intervention, hadn't had gender-affirming surgeries of any kind. And they find that, of course, the endocrine intervention, the hormone replacement therapy, gender-affirming hormones, associated with improved mental health and improved quality of life for both young people who are male to female, and young people who are female to male, transgender folk. But it was particularly stronger in trans girls, in trans femme participants, which I think is something they consider might well be due to how the different changes of the different kinds of hormones happen at different times. So in the study period that they managed in the first 6 months, and then 6 months after that, the first year essentially, that the effect was strongest for people who were engaging in feminizing hormones. Then we have Cooper and colleagues from 2020, Body Dissatisfaction and Mental Health Outcomes of Youth on Gender-Affirming Hormone Therapy in the journal Pediatrics. That's the second pediatric study that was considered low quality. That's pretty surprising. Pediatrics, let me check. Yeah, the impact factor for pediatrics is 8, which is incredibly high when you're talking about psychological, when you're talking about journals that look at psychological outcomes. Getting published in pediatrics is impressive to my mind. So it's interesting that they were excluded. By the by. So these were participants, young people who received gender-affirming hormone therapy from a multidisciplinary program in Dallas, Texas. They brought together 148 young people aged between 9 and 18 years, mean age of just shy of 15 years, who were receiving gender-affirming hormone therapy in this multidisciplinary program in Texas. There were 123 of those folks on feminizing or masculinizing hormone therapy, and they looked at body image, they looked at depression, they looked at anxiety, and they at the initial presentation to the clinic before they had started hormones, and then again at follow-up. On average, the follow-up was 1 year later. So the breakdown was about 90 trans guys and about 55 trans girls. And participants reported large improvements in body dissatisfaction during the 1 year follow-up period. They also reported modest improvements in mental health functioning. And they conclude by saying that the current study is the largest longitudinal study of youth receiving gender-affirming hormone therapy to date and documents important improvements in body dissatisfaction over the first year of treatment. Then we go on to Tordoff. We'll get there. Gone through a few. We'll get there. Tordoff and colleagues. Mental health outcomes in transgender and non-binary youth receiving gender-affirming care from 2022. This final sample included 104 young people aged 13 to 20, average age of just shy of 16. They brought together, it was 63 trans masculine youth, 27 trans feminine youth, and 10 non-binary or gender fluid youth, and 4 youths that responded I don't know or didn't respond to the gender identity question. And they took a look at the effects of those folks receiving gender affirming hormones, and they looked at baseline 3-month follow-up, 6-month follow-up, and 12-month follow-up. And they managed to get 65 of these to do all 12 months of follow-up. 84 of them managed to do the 6-month follow-up. And they say this: receipt of gender-affirming hormones, specifically puberty blockers or gender-affirming hormones, was associated with a 60% lower odds of moderate to severe depressive symptoms and 73% lower odds of self-harm or suicidal thoughts during the first year of multidisciplinary gender care. Among youths who didn't initiate hormone blockers or gender-affirming hormones, we observed that depressive symptoms and suicidality were 2-fold to 3-fold higher than baseline levels at 3 and 6 months of follow-up, respectively. Our study results suggest that risks of depression and suicidality may be mitigated with receipt of gender-affirming medications in the context of a multidisciplinary care clinic over a relatively short time frame of 1 year. Important finding, once again, gender-affirming hormones as part of broader transition, as part of multidisciplinary care, can form an important part of transgender youth's transition journey and mental health journey over time. Now we have Cantu and colleagues in 2020, changes in anxiety and depression from intake to first follow-up among transgender youth in a pediatric endocrinology clinic in transgender health. These were participants who were seeking gender-affirming care at an academic medical center in the northwestern United States. 80 young people participated between the age of 11 and 18. And they looked at changes in anxiety, depression, and suicidality from initial appointment to first follow-up. Now, the problem here, there is a problem. The average time between the first visit and follow-up was only 4 months, and gender-affirming hormones were rarely actually prescribed at the first meeting. Participants had to engage in a bunch of steps between first and second appointment to receive gender-affirming hormones, and would meet those steps and then receive gender-affirming hormones somewhere between the first and second visit. Those steps included extensive counseling, consent forms. They had to complete a bunch of assessments, and they needed a letter of support from an experienced mental health provider to be able to access gender-affirming hormones. So it was at most 3 to 4 months follow-up, but it was probably more like 1 to 2 months, maybe 3, depending on when people actually started to take their gender-affirming hormones for the first time, sometime between first and second follow-up. And ultimately, the results of the study is that no clinically significant changes in mood symptoms occurred in this initial time frame. But the authors highlight that this is unusual for the field, and they say that it may be related to the fact that masculinizing and feminizing physical changes occur more slowly after initiation of gender-affirming hormones than the first couple of months, essentially. A change to which I can attest. It takes freaking ages. Next up, we have Turpin and colleagues. Yay, cheers from the audience, Turpin and colleagues. Every time we hear from Jack Turpin, it's time for applause because the studies are always awesome. Hey, Turpin, if you can hear me in the audience, I salute you. Absolutely brilliant. Turpin and colleagues, 2022, access to gender-affirming hormones during adolescence and mental health outcomes among transgender adults. In PLOS One, they brought together, this is, of course, from the giant survey we've talked about a bunch of times, 27,715 participants from all US states, all 50 US states, as well as Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the US territories abroad. But, of course, not all participants, not all people who are transgender are seeking gender-affirming hormones. So they brought only the people together who were seeking gender-affirming hormones, whether or not they had received them. Now, this study, I gotta say, is one of my favorites, maybe my favorite of the 9. It's really cool. So they brought together 21,598 participants who wanted gender-affirming hormones at some point, right? Now, bear in mind that this study was not included in the systematic review for some reason. Too low quality, 21,000 participants, too low quality. I realize participant numbers are not, quality is more than just about participants. I know that. But it's still a lot of voices to just ignore. The first group they had wanted gender-affirming hormones, but had never accessed them, right? That's a fairly large group of people. It's about 8,860 participants who wanted gender-affirming hormones but never been able to access them. Then they have 12,257 participants who wanted gender-affirming hormones but could only access them in adulthood. Then 119 accessed gender-affirming hormones in early adolescence, and 362 accessed them for the first time in late adolescence. So, once again, where the CAS review is kind of criticizing the lack of large, high quality, large studies. Of course, here we have a huge sample of adults in the US. Some 21,500 adults, and of those, only just shy of 500 had accessed gender-affirming hormones at any point in adolescence. So, making large scale studies in this field is hard because there is not a large population to draw from. That's in the whole of the US, right? The whole of the US. How are you going to do a large scale study with thousands of kids in the UK? There are not that many kids accessing gender affirming hormones. So these authors were able to adjust for demographic and potential compounding variables. That's really important, actually, because the participants who reported accessing gender-affirming hormones during late adolescence were quite young. Their median age was 19. Of course, that's the case because gender-affirming hormones haven't been around that long for accessible in adolescence. So they're going to be a younger group, but they adjusted for those variables. And they looked at people's recall of receiving gender-affirming hormones during late adolescence and whether that, compared to people who wanted them and had never accessed them, whether those folk who had accessed them in adolescence had a improved psychological distress and suicidal ideation in particular, right? And they found that accessing gender-affirming hormones, recalling accessing them for the first time during late adolescence, was associated with a lower odds of past month severe psychological distress and past year suicidal ideation compared to people who wanted gender-affirming hormones but had never been able to access them. They say this represents a 153% decrease in the adjusted odds for past months severe psychological distress and a 62% decrease for past year suicidal ideation, which is huge, right, already. Now, what they could also do is compare people who received gender-affirming hormones for the first time in adolescence to people who received gender-affirming hormones for the first time in adulthood. And they found that access to gender-affirming hormones during adolescence, aged between 14 and 17, that is, was associated with lower odds of past month severe psychological distress, past year suicidal ideation, past month binge drinking, and lifetime illicit drug use, compared to people who had accessed gender-affirming hormones but had only done it for the first time in adulthood. Now, to my mind, this is pretty strong evidence, right? Because while there might be concerns about bias, I don't think that participants are going to be able to predict what these folk found, right? What the researchers found. I mean, I'm a researcher and I didn't expect to see what I saw in this study, right? The idea that gender-affirming hormones in adolescence was associated with improved psychological distress, suicidal ideation, binge drinking, and illicit drug use, like, compared to people who received gender-affirming hormones but only in adulthood for the first time. That's surprising to me. So I can't imagine that participants were, there was any kind of participant researcher effect where the participants behaved in accordance with researcher expectations, because I'm not sure that this surprising effect was expected by anyone. Super interesting. Now we have Fontanari and colleagues in 2020. Gender affirmation is associated with transgender and gender non-binary youth mental health improvement in LGBT health. 350 transgender boys, transgender girls, and gender non-binary Brazilian youth from the age of 16 to 24. They brought them together and ultimately ended up with 149 young people identified as transgender guys, 25 young people identified as transgender girls, and 116 young people identified as gender non-binary. Their mean age was 18.6, so just into adulthood. Quite a lot of still young people, but quite a lot of young people below the age of 18 in the study. And they found that having accessed multiple steps of gender affirmation, both social, legal, and medical or surgical, was associated with fewer symptoms of depression and less anxiety. They also say that furthermore, engaging in gender affirmation processes help youth to develop a sense of pride and positivity about their gender identity and a feeling of being socially accepted. Then we have Becca Hebley and colleagues in 2021, psychosocial health in adolescents and young adults with gender dysphoria before and after gender-affirming medical interventions, a descriptive study from the Hamburg Gender Identity Service in European Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. These researchers brought together 75. That's actually quite a big dropout. They had 204 eligible for participation, and they invited them to participate, and only 75 agreed to participate. Folk who had engaged in the Hamburg Gender Identity Service. They had 64 trans guys and 11 trans girls who had received some form of intervention at the Gender Identity Service. And they took a look at the difference between folks who had received no medical intervention, those who had received only puberty suppression, those who had received only gender-affirming hormones, and those who had received both puberty suppression and gender-affirming hormones. And they looked at those both at baseline and then around 2 years later at follow-up. And they found, particularly for the gender-affirming hormone group, the total problem and internalizing problem scores were significantly different from the norm means at follow-up, as was the mental quality of life score, but they were improved following the intervention. So basically, these participants who received gender-affirming hormones had total problem scores and internalizing problem scores that were better following the intervention than they were at baseline, but they were still sort of significantly different to the norm means at follow-up, which we found before, right? This is a population that even when they engage in transition, maybe particularly when they engage in transition, are exposed to the kind of discrimination and prejudice of society towards transgender people. So their total problem scores and internalizing problem scores are likely to remain higher because they're going to be exposed to those things, would be my guess. But here, what they said is thus: adolescents who had undergone a full social transition and gender-affirming medical treatment at the Hamburg Gender Identity Service presented psychosocial health scores that were improved, closer to the norm, compared to their scores upon entering the clinic, and compared to the scores of the groups who had received no medical interventions or only puberty suppression. And finally, we have Arclius and colleagues' risk factors for non-suicidal self-injury among trans youth in the Journal of Sexual Medicine. These folk brought together 268 people, 121 who were trans guys and 136 who were trans girls. That might be a bit of a broad brush. They had 121 who were assigned female at birth and 136 were assigned male at birth. And these were all people who had been to the National Gender Identity Clinic Service in the UK clinic between 2012 and 2015, November 2012 and June 2015. Now, what was interesting about this sample is that it's a sample that was particularly affected by transphobia, which is really interesting. They found that those with the lifetime presence of non-suicidal self-injury had significantly greater psychopathology, lower self-esteem, and had suffered more transphobia, and had experienced greater interpersonal problems than those without non-suicidal self-injury. So that's kind of interesting, and it might explain their findings a little bit. They found that receiving cross-sex hormones or puberty blockers were not predictive of less non-suicidal self-injury or less psychopathology. They said that further analyses confirmed that general psychopathology itself could be predicted by transphobic experiences, low self-esteem, and interpersonal problems, but not by the use of cross-sex hormones. So, I think this isn't as dissonant a finding as it seems. I think what we're finding is that even in like some of the studies that we've already reviewed that was finding that gender-affirming hormones like reduced psychopathology or that improved anxiety and depression, it didn't always improve it to normative levels. And that's the same in the studies that were reviewed by the systematic review, the 5 that were included. They weren't always raised to normative levels. And the reason is quite possibly because transphobia and discrimination and prejudice and, the wider societal challenges that trans people experience, getting access to healthcare or to psychological support or, getting access to work and employment and to education and without transphobia. So I think what Arclius and colleagues find is consistent with what everyone else has found, which is that transphobia is super bad for mental health, essentially. And in this sample, transphobia was specifically one of the big predictors of non-suicidal self-injury and general psychopathology. But it's still nonetheless pretty interesting that it wasn't like there was no amelioration significantly at all by cross-sex hormones, in this case, by gender-affirming hormones. So what do we find? In answer to this question from the health secretary, in the systematic review that was at the heart of the heart of the CAS review, particularly when it comes to gender affirming hormones, the psychological outcomes in those 9 studies, we find that 7 of those studies that were not included, 9 studies were not included. Of those 9, 7 of them find quite significant positive, in some cases very strong effects on anxiety and depression, on total problem and internalizing problems, on body image, on all kinds of, on severe psychological distress, on all kinds of outcomes, right? We find that on suicidal thoughts and self-harm. There are so many studies in here that are finding various quite positive effects of gender-affirming hormones for those who need it. And that also compounds the positive effect that the 5 studies that were included in this systematic review found on the psychological functioning of people engaging in gender-affirming hormones. So I think, what we have to say here is that, for sure, we absolutely need more high quality research in this field. For sure, we need higher quality research, and for sure, we should be investing in research in this field. But I don't think that the research is as confused, as controversial as it's being made out to be. While there may not be a lot of very big studies, multi-center trials, there is a lot of work being done and has been found in the systematic review search, but weren't included because they were too low quality, in inverted commas. Now, I understand the review of studies as being low quality. I don't think that's a problem, but I do think it's a bit of a problem to exclude them, because that assumes that they have nothing to teach us of relevance to this question. And I think what we have absolutely found here is that they have a clear contribution to be made to this answer to this question. And to the Health Secretary, I would say I understand the desire to move in an evidence-based way. And I don't doubt that that's what we're aiming to do here. And I'm sure that the CAS review helps to understand that there's not a lot of high-quality evidence in this field and that we need more evidence. But please don't look at this systematic review. Don't look at the results of the CAS review as evidence that we should prevent people from having access to healthcare. What we see from this review, from our own reviews, from the systematic review commissioned by WPATH, by the countless medical associations around the world who are in charge of transgender healthcare, what we know is that transgender young people are real. There are people out there for whom their gender identity is dissonant from how they were assigned at birth. And I return to the comments of DeVries and colleagues, right? When they said in their conclusion, apparently the clinical protocol of a multidisciplinary team with mental health professionals, physicians, and surgeons gave these formerly dysphoric youth the opportunity to develop into well-functioning adults. Transition support is part of that process in the clinics that are being studied here. And actually what we can do if we listen to their voices, do what the CAS review says early in the piece. If we listen to young people and if we believe them, then we can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so much for joining me. You are very, very welcome here. I'm going to take a couple of weeks off while I go abroad, but as soon as I come back, I look forward to seeing you, as always, in